My name is Jacob Ward. I wear two hats. I am both a PhD student here at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm also the program manager for analysis at the U.S. Department of Energy. So especially excited to be able to wear both hats at this event today. Our next panel is Smart Cities, Transportation Infrastructure, Electrification, and the Autonomous Sharing Economy. I'm happy to announce an exceptional set of panelists, including Costa Samaras, who is not only the moderator, but also my PhD advisor, an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering here at Carnegie Mellon University. His research spans energy, climate change, vehicle automation, and defense analysis, and he directs the Center for Engineering and Resilience for Climate Adaptation. He is an affiliated faculty member in Carnegie Mellon's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, the College of Engineering's Energy, Science, Technology, and Policy program, and by courtesy, a faculty member in the H. John Heinz III College. Costa is also an adjunct senior researcher at the RAND Corporation. Not next to Costa, but framing Costa, we'll do sandwich introductions. We have Joe DiMatteo, Director of Business Development for Duquesne Light Company. Joe is the Director of Business Development there. He is responsible for identifying and executing on new investment opportunities and developing the company's long-term business strategy, including its role in advancing transportation electrification. Jumping across the stage a little bit there, we have Darren Epps, who's a product development specialist who helps lead electric transportation efforts at Atlanta-based Southern Company's Energy Innovation Center. Mr. Epps is currently focused on developing a next-generation electric vehicle charger, second-use electric vehicle programs, and innovative turnkey charging bundles for municipalities and fleets. We also have another colleague of mine, Sarah Alaksek, back here on your left-hand side of the stage. She is the Energy Efficient Mobility Systems Manager at the U.S. Department of Energy, where she manages transportation projects that help smart cities increase energy efficiency and reduce emissions through the convergence of connectivity, automation, shared mobility, multimodal urban transport, and EV charging infrastructure. She also wears lots of hats. Back on the other side of the stage, we have Karina Ricks, the Director of the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. The department is responsible for the transportation of people and goods throughout the city of Pittsburgh and for managing the operation of and access to the public right-of-way. And finally, in the center, we have Sherry Shapiro, who is the Senior Manager of Public Affairs for Pennsylvania and Delaware for Uber. Sherry leads Uber's public and government affairs efforts in Pennsylvania and Delaware. She spearheaded Uber's successful campaign in 2016 to legalize ride-sharing across Pennsylvania. Please welcome our panel, and Costa, with that, I give it to you.
Thank you all for being here, and it's an honor to be introduced by one of our great graduate students that I co-advise with some of my colleagues here in the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, and to be joined by such an illustrious panel of transportation leaders. Our panel today is about the future, and about the future of smart cities, the future of transportation, and the integration with the sharing economy, the integration with the electricity sector. And I wanted to mention that today, the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation kicked off our latest update for our emissions index that you can find at emissionsindex.org. And that helps us understand the impacts of maybe charging electric vehicles or using electricity across the country. So I invite all of you all to visit that website. Before we get too deep into that, I wanted to start here by understanding the future of a place like Pittsburgh. And I'm going to ask the panel, and we'll start with Karina, help us imagine what a smart city means to everyday folks and what the future of a place like Pittsburgh means to everyday people. And maybe you can help us understand what will a place like Pittsburgh look like in 25 years from a transportation or energy perspective.
So I think when we're looking out 25 years, it's really helpful to look backwards to see where we've been. Maybe not 25 years, but maybe looking back 40 years, when Pittsburgh was a city twice its size. We were 600,000 plus people in this city. We had a robust economy. Many people, the primary commuting modes at that time were walking, using one of our 770 sets of stairs to get to and from the mills. We had a expansive transit system. We're continuously digging up rails that we didn't even know existed underneath our streets, of the vast streetcar system that once plied the city. But we also had a lot of challenges. We had horrific air quality. We had very compromised rivers. We paid a price for that economic robustness that we had in the city. So I think looking forward, when we look forward 25 years, I think we take the best of the past, but we also learn from it. I think a smart city, when we talk about energy, when we talk about at CMU, inevitably autonomy, that we also need to think about those lesser celebrated modes of walking and bicycling and transit use. The city of the future that I see is one where we again see walking and bicycling as being some of the primary means of getting around the city, especially for those very short trips that make up more than 60% of the trips that we make in our daily lives. When I think about autonomy and electrification, I really want to see that pushed into the transit sector, not necessarily the low capacity autonomous vehicles, but higher capacity buses, trains, and others that ply our city so that we can really dramatically reduce the operational costs of that mode and have a level of service that is as great as we enjoy during peak hour with very marginal costs additional to that system. And so where single occupant or low occupancy all electric autonomous mobility really is an ancillary supplement to that backbone system where the majority of our travel is taken by bicycling, walking, and transit.
Great. So Sherry, what does it look like for Uber? What's Uber's vision of a future city 25 years from now?
So first, I want to say that it looks a lot like what Karina just articulated. The idea for Uber is to have a very multimodal means of transportation. Public transit will always be the most efficient and the most environmentally beneficial way for people to get from place to place. Bicycles and walking excluded, of course. So it will be a very multimodal universe powered by electricity or something better if we can get there. And most importantly for us, both electric and shared. Shared is really a piece of this that we need to bring in beyond just public transit, but shared rides in individual cars as well. Something along the lines of 70% of trips now are taken in cars with one person in them. If we don't start shifting that mindset as well as adding the electric and autonomous pieces to it, we'll be missing out on a great opportunity to benefit cities.
So you mentioned the electric part, and maybe we can go over to Joe and help us understand how an electric utility, especially a local distribution company, views what a smart city looks like 25 years from now.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, to build off both Karina and Sherry's comments, I think we recognize that the city 25 years from now in the transportation sector, electricity is going to be potentially the primary fuel source, at least a much more substantial fuel source. So I was actually looking at some projections preparing for our talk today, and some industry outlooks are actually forecasting that over 50% of light-duty passenger cars by 2040 will be EVs. So that's a massive shift from where we're at today. So as the utility in the provider of that fuel source, we're taking steps now to prepare ourselves for that future. So the spring of last year, we made an announcement, a strategic announcement that we were going to be advancing and playing a strategic role advancing transportation electrification in the region. We started by electrifying our own fleet, so to really learn the benefits of and the operations of electric vehicles. We have 18 vehicles that have been electrified in our own fleet. And then over the next several years, really for the foreseeable future, we're projecting to invest nearly 20% of our annual fleet budget in electric vehicles. So some significant investment on that front. And then really taking the next step, looking at deploying charging infrastructure to understand how charging of vehicles impacts our distribution system. That's another massive step that we're taking, and really illustrated by the partnership that we announced earlier this year with Uber. So as we're trying to increase the number of Uber EV drivers, Duquesne Light's really going to play the role in helping deploy that the fast charging infrastructure that's needed for those Uber EV drivers. So those are some of the steps that we're taking to prepare ourselves for that shift in the transportation sector in the future.
Darren, maybe you can build on that, coming from a different type of utility. Are utilities ready for this type of environment? What can they do?
I think we're getting ready now. I think we're getting ready now. There we go. I think we see the future of transportation as connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. The question we're working to solve is, how would you support the infrastructure for an autonomous fleet? And we talked about that backstage. I'm sorry to report we did not come up with any solutions, but right now, cars are parked 96% of the time. That is a market that's asking to be disrupted. Right now, my car's been at the Atlanta airport since yesterday. It'll be there today, tomorrow, just sitting there doing nothing. Could it be putting power back on the grid? I drive a Nissan Leaf. In the future state, yes. Could it be working for me right now and delivering goods? In the future state, I think it will. We talk all the time to builders in Atlanta who are putting up parking structures, and they are trying to think about how to build a parking structure for the next 50 years. And do they build the parking deck so it can be easily converted into, say, more condos? Because I think everyone sees this happening. It's happening right now, bringing up the Atlanta airport again. They had plans to add a lot more parking, and they tore them up because it's cheaper if you're going to be at the airport for 2 or 3 or 4 more days to just take an Uber to the airport instead of parking and paying $16 a day. In that same vein, we think cars will be electric because the cost per mile is so much lower when you drive an electric versus gas. That's sort of how, just building on everyone else's point, how we see the future of mobility in Atlanta and beyond.
Great. So Sarah works at the Department of Energy, which is a multi-hatted organization, as many of you know, mostly responsible for the design and safeguarding of our nuclear weapons system, as well as the advancement of high-energy physics and science. A small part of that, which we think is a very important part, is kind of developing the next generation of our energy technology. And maybe, Sarah, you can give us an understanding of how is the Department of Energy preparing for this world of shared, automated electric transportation, and what are the things on the horizon that we might be able to expect?
Yeah, so at the Department of Energy, our biggest goals to help cities move forward in the next 25 years, we're working alongside the Department of Transportation to make mobility more equitable, make it more accessible, and make it more affordable to everyday American consumers, drivers of vehicles. So what we're working on always is, for example, with electric vehicles, is going to be investments in research and development to bring down the costs of the vehicles. So we do that primarily, the largest portion of our budget goes toward improving battery capacity and battery resilience. Since 2008, we've brought down battery costs by 80%. That's significant, and we still have so much room to go further. On the other side of the coin, we're working to increase the battery capacity. So every year, automakers that we're working with in partnership are putting out vehicles that have higher and higher, longer and longer vehicle ranges. So again, this goes back to making these vehicles more affordable and more convenient for drivers. And it's not just about making mobility more convenient with electric vehicles, but we still have to think about all those traditional internal combustion engine vehicles on the road as well. So how are we making those vehicles more fuel efficient as well? And we're making big gains there through advancements in high-strength steel, lightweighting, reducing rolling resistance in tires. So there's just a lot of gains that can be made with increasing vehicle efficiency, and I'll talk a little bit more later probably about some of the systems level work that we're doing.
Great. Well, Sherry, you mentioned the importance of sharing and how do we get to sharing. We know that sharing is helpful for the environmental impacts of automation and for transportation, but do we think sharing is likely? And what are some of the barriers to sharing? And I get asked a lot, will autonomous vehicles be shared, or will they be privately owned, or will there be a combination of both? What are your thoughts on that?
So let's go to the experience that we've had. Uber has a product in many cities called Uber Pool. And Uber Pool is exactly what it sounds like. You pick up one passenger, and then you pick up another passenger who's going in the same route and direction, and then you drop them off. The two barriers to carpooling have historically been inconvenience. You go with Larry in the morning, Larry has to stay late for a meeting, and you've lost your ride home. And cost, right? It's easier and less expensive to simply drive your own car, no aggravation. What we found is that through technology, this has really broken through on the first primary barrier. By pooling people by trip as opposed to by individual person, you get rid of that inconvenience and uncertainty factor. That's really been a huge change. Also, people will carpool if the cost is low enough. So by having pooled rides lowers the cost, and therefore people are more likely to take them. What we've found is in pool cities, about 20% of our rides are pool rides, and that is growing. And we're doing continual improvement to the pool product.
Excellent. Well, I mean, the comments that Karina made in the beginning, which is about looking backward and thinking about our past, got me thinking about our previous transportation revolutions and how they really opened up a lot of new access and mobility for a whole bunch of different populations. Another thing that they also did was sometimes bisect neighborhoods, wall off neighborhoods, destroy neighborhoods. And I wonder how we can make choices at the beginning of this transportation revolution with the hindsight of the things that we've done wrong in the past so that we don't repeat some of those mistakes. And how could a smart city also improve equity, environmental justice, and access?
Yeah, I assume this to me.
This to you.
So it's a big question, and it's something that we really need to wrestle with. Again, back in the city of the past, when walking and bicycling and transit were the dominant modes of travel, we did have less transportation inequity. These are very democratic forms of mobility. The costs are very flat across the board. Today, the cost of owning and operating a private automobile is about $10,000 a year, $9,200 per year, according to AAA, for every year that you own and operate a vehicle, and that's before you pay for parking. So that cost can go significantly up. That's per car per year. So for households that are earning below the median income, that is a substantial cost. In the Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania region, our households that are in the lower fifth quintile of income, their household transportation costs are nearly double what their household housing costs are. So transportation costs are about double what housing costs are for the lowest quintile income earners in the region. So it's very important, and that in part is because we've built a society now in this age that does require the owning and operation and maintenance of a private automobile if you are to get to a number of the job centers that some of the lowest income earners are most apt to be matched with. These job centers are out in the suburban districts. These job centers are reporting times are in non-peak times. They're in the off-peak periods. And very difficult to get to. We no longer really have that walk-centric urban form. We no longer really have the kind of ubiquitous transit service that we had. So I think, again, I'll keep hitting this drum of autonomous, electric, shared mobility means mass transit. To the extent that it can for cities, that's the best way that we can do it. We have 3,000 mass transit vehicles in Allegheny County. We have hundreds of thousands of privately owned vehicles. So we really, the way to the future is to expand that transit fleet, increase mass transit usage, increase the efficiency, convenience, and attractiveness of that mode. That can decrease the environmental consequences, which again disproportionately affect lower income populations, more isolated populations. It can increase their access to jobs and employment, and can help them raise their standard of living. My department is a new department, and I like to sort of repeat the mission that we've adopted, which is drawn from research done in Harvard University that says that commuting is the single largest factor that influences a household's ability to escape poverty. Their access to transportation is more important than the quality of the schools or the quality of the housing in these areas. And so the mission of my department is to provide the physical mobility that's necessary for the economic mobility that people seek. And we do this through the promotion of shared electric autonomy, shared electric mobility that does really, again, democratize access to economic opportunity.
Excellent. Well, the theme that we keep hearing is shared electric mobility. Joe and Darren mentioned some of the things that the utilities are doing to prepare the grid for potential charging. But maybe you can give us a sense about some of the barriers to electric vehicle mass adoption, and when we might see a whole bunch of these vehicles on the road. Maybe we start with Darren.
So I think one of the barriers right now, and Ann mentioned this earlier, is going to be the infrastructure. If you look at the electric vehicle market right now, the models are getting more sophisticated. The batteries are getting bigger. The ranges are getting longer. The technology is getting better for charging. What's not kept up as much as the infrastructure, and that's because there's a tough ROI on infrastructure. You know, a fast charger is about $30,000. Could be 20 to 40 in installation, and you're charging $2, an hour. That's a long time to get your money back. So, like Ann said earlier, a regulatory process that helps the utility consider charging infrastructure as an extension of the grid, I think would be a lot better. We're looking at 350 kilowatt hour charging right now, high powered charging. I think this changes in probably around 2025. So when you look at what it costs to drive a gas vehicle, which you just mentioned, that has continued to go up as regulations get stronger. The cost to buy an electric vehicle continues to go down, and I think around 2025 those lines meet, and at that point it's just cheaper to buy an electric vehicle than a gas vehicle, even without considering the savings in fuel costs, the savings in maintenance. So I think 2025 is kind of the date we have pegged. I think it's somewhat what some of the automakers have pegged as when the cost parity is reached with gas and electric vehicles.
Joe, you have anything to add on that front?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things that Darren said. And if you look at as far as the 2025 date, I think that coincides with many of the major automakers have announced over the past several months billions and billions and billions of dollars that they're investing in vehicle electrification. Ford announced that they're going to be investing, I think, $11 billion by 2022. GM's going to have 20 additional EV models. You run through the list of all the major auto manufacturers, and these companies are focusing significant dollars in this space. And I think, I've always went by the old adage of you follow the money, and they're investing the money in this space. And I think with that, with the decrease in battery costs that was mentioned by Sarah earlier, you're going to hit a point where it just makes more sense. The performance of the electric vehicle is better. You don't have to take it into the shop to get the oil change. So there's just a lot of benefits to driving electric. And then just a couple other points. Locally, I think that we're not as mature in Western Pennsylvania as some other EV markets. There's roughly 1,500 vehicles within our Duquesne Light service territory, EVs that are registered as of the end of the year. So we still have some barriers to cross as far as education goes. So that's something that we're trying to do as the utility. We're trying to educate our customers. We've been the title sponsor at the Pittsburgh Home and Garden Show for 20 plus years, I think now. So the past couple of years, we've put together a significant piece of our exhibit has been dedicated purely to electric vehicle education. As part of the partnership with Uber, a big component of that will be partnering with the local nonprofit to be determined to help educate Uber drivers that will in turn help educate Uber riders. So we think that, that crossing that education barrier is another significant piece for a market that's still kind of at the early stages that we are at here in Western PA.
Great. Well, so one of the things that we've done at Carnegie Mellon for a long time through my colleagues at the Vehicle Electrification Group is understanding the environmental impacts of electric vehicles. So maybe, Sarah, you can help us understand, will shared automated electric vehicles be any better for the environment? What if I were to live 2 hours away and start driving a lot more? What is the grid going to look like? How do we assess if these are going to be good or not?
It's a great question, and conveniently, the Department of Energy has a brand new program that we've just stood up to answer these questions. It's called the Energy Efficient Mobility Systems Program, and if there's any, for all the students that are in the room, if you want an exciting, hot area to do research in, and hint, hint, there may be money here in the near future, there already is, but there will be more. Check out Google DOE Energy Efficient Mobility Systems. And so what this program is doing is it's looking to understand how we increase, this is a new metric, mobility, energy, productivity. So how do we increase the bang for the buck that we get on every unit of goods or people moved? We know that with the advent of autonomous vehicles and increase in shared mobility, that VMT is likely going to rise. We think that there's going to be an increased accessibility for more people to move more. And the administration is very supportive of that. We should not be hindering people's accessibility and ability to move. But how do we do it in the most energy efficient way? So of course, this is looking at increased use of mass transit, increased use of shared mobility, limiting empty miles driven, and doing all of this in the most energy efficient way possible. And we're not just talking about when we think about smart cities and energy and mobility, a lot of people think strictly of electric vehicles. And I just want people to be thinking about how much bigger it is than that. It's not just EVs, it's about doing all of our mobility in the most efficient way possible. And so what the Energy Efficient Mobility Systems program is doing is we're starting to think with cities, how do we harness the power of data, the massive amounts of data that we have access to in our mobility systems, and use that to increase the efficiency of those systems. And so working with partners like Uber, for example, actually in one of our Living Labs projects, we're looking at how we can do just that. So we're doing work in 5 activity areas, but 2 that I'll highlight is the Smart Mobility Laboratory Consortium, which 5 national labs, NREL, Idaho National Lab, Oak Ridge National Lab, Argonne National Lab, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab are all part of. We're doing research on advanced fueling infrastructure needs, connected and automated vehicles, urban science, and a couple other new discipline areas where we're standing up just new fundamental basic research endeavors in this space to understand the energy impacts with these technologies. And then our Living Labs projects are kind of the real world technology integration or deployment of these technologies, and we're recording data and we're working with cities and the private sector to look at this data and understand how we can make more, increase our mobility energy productivity. So definitely check out those programs. And an early finding, when we stood the program up, we did a very high level bounding study just on connected and automated vehicles. And we found that there is the potential to increase energy consumption by 200% or decrease energy consumption by, just making sure I have it right, 60%. So that is a huge range, and it just shows how much more work is needed in this space, hence the dollars going into investments in research to understand this better and help cities make choices that are going to steer them in the more energy efficient direction.
So you mentioned choices. Sherry, you want to add to that? I was asking what the policy landscape, what are those choices, right? So.
Right, so it's interesting you should say that. One of the areas that we are particularly supportive of at Uber is congestion pricing. Are people making the right decisions about what mode of transportation to make at the right times? So you're really maximizing the efficiency and the use of the most efficient mode for the time of day or activity. And that is a really strong lever that has been shown to work in the different places that it's been in place, like London, and to use that lever to achieve the goals that Sarah was articulating.
Karina, what do you think about the policy landscape to encourage some of the better outcomes in this smarter city environment? What are some of the bigger choices that we might be needing to consider over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I would concur with Sherry that we do need to understand sort of what the monetization of that's the wrong phrase, I guess, but that there is a cost, both a actual cost as well as a social cost associated with our mobility choices coming from the city. It also means that our revenues will actually change. We do get a significant amount of revenue from parking, for example, in a shared and autonomous mobility future. It does mean that we need to think about that differently. The significant costs, the significant revenue that funds the investment in infrastructure and the maintenance of our transportation facilities is from liquid fuels tax, which we're all delighted to see go away, but we do need to then replace those revenue sources with something else, because we're still going to need the streets and bridges and sidewalks and lights that we use there. And so really that's some of the critical questions that are in front of cities right now, and states as well, is to understand how do we promote this great green transformation to more sustainable modes of mobility, which we very, very much want to see thrive and be adopted, but at the same time we need to backfill that so that we can continue to fund the maintenance and operations of our transportation systems.
Well, given that the federal gas tax has not been raised or indexed for inflation since 1993, what's the appetite for a vehicle miles traveled fee?
So vehicle miles traveled, I think that there's great appetite for it, and conceptually it seems like a very good idea. There's a lot of issues associated with that, and various tests have been done to evaluate that. One of the issues is that right now the liquid fuels tax is gathered at point of sale. So if you're driving on the turnpike between Ohio and Pennsylvania, if you fuel up at a Pennsylvania rest stop, Pennsylvania gets your money. If you fuel up at an Ohio rest stop, Ohio gets your money. If it's vehicle miles traveled, we now have privacy concerns as to understand where you're traveling, when and how far and at what times. And as Sherry mentioned, that's one of the challenges with congestion pricing as well, is that it does sort of indicate a need for tracking you in a way. So there's still some bugs to be worked out on the vehicle miles traveled. We've also talked, Robin Chase, who's been a real leader in this space around shared and autonomous mobility, has talked a lot about having sort of a volume tax, for lack of a better term, which is understanding if a human being generally can travel, taking up the space of about 3 cubic feet in surface area. If you start to use modes like private vehicle travel, which actually consume about 1,000 square feet if you're the only one in that vehicle, versus a higher occupancy mode that you would then be charged for that utilization of the right-of-way, and calculating it in various ways like that.
Yeah, so interesting. So a space-based tax rather than a weight or
right.
efficiency tax. Yes, Darren.
Yeah, and that's important to figure out a new model, because in Georgia, anyone who drives an electric vehicle, to make up for the gas tax, they charge you every day on my birthday. I get $200 registration fee to sort of make up for the lack of fuel I'm using. Meanwhile, the average SUV driver pays about $130 in gas tax a year. So I'm paying more than anybody in the state in gas tax. So there does need to be a discussion about a different model to assess those fees. Because as an EV driver, I want the roads to be great. I want to pay my share, but it's not fair the way it currently is set up. And then other states are starting to follow suit.
Well, as a recovering transportation engineer, I'm going to disappoint you and say that neither you nor the SUV is causing much road damage. It's nearly all heavy trucks that are damaging the road on a day-to-day basis, and there is a cross subsidy between cars, bikes, SUVs towards the heavy trucks on our roadways. But
And I'm obligated to say snow.
snow,
On a rough winter.
yes, yeah, snow and our salting of the roads. A lot of this has been talked about with the electrification of the transportation sector as pretty key towards this smart city and advanced mobility concept. Joe and Darren have talked about the ability of the infrastructure. What about the generation assets and how we might continue to see generation assets play into this space? Will there be a lot of distributed generation in cities 15 years from now? Or is it going to be a more still kind of centralized grid operation? We start with Joe, or you want to start with Darren?
Yeah, no, I can kick that one off. No, I think we're seeing more and more interest in from a customer perspective, and with costs coming down on distributed generation, I do think that you're going to see an uptick or a greater prevalence of distributed generation. The recent First Energy Solutions bankruptcy filing, the statements that they've made regarding closing some of their biggest central station facilities, I think that those are indicative of the time that we're in. So with that, it's imperative that we invest in our distribution grid, our distribution and transmission grid assets, to make sure that we have the capacity, they have the ability to take into account this proliferation of distributed energy resources. And I think it was mentioned earlier as well, vehicles could be a distributed energy resource in the future. And I think that as we see increased adoption of electric vehicles, that's just another asset that we're going to have to manage, and then we're going to have to create a grid that is a platform to manage all of these distributed energy resources. So we're investing those dollars today with an eye towards the future, that it will be an environment with greater distributed generation.
Fantastic. Any thoughts on that?
So we're testing that right now. We have 2 smart neighborhoods, one in Georgia and one in Alabama. The one in Georgia, we have rooftop solar. All the appliances in the house will be connected and smart, and we want to test how people interact with a smart home and study how generation works off the rooftop solar. And that will also inform our R&D. It also informs maybe the future of home building. So we want to learn that. The one in Alabama is a little bit different. It has all the whiz-bang devices in the house, but the neighborhood is going to be powered by a microgrid. So a different technology, and again, we want to study that. Does that make sense for future home building? So in both cases, we partnered with a home builder, and we're all learning a lot about the future of homes, and is distributed generation the answer. We're also doing a pilot in Atlanta, a smart cities pilot. So we own a lot of light poles in the southeast, and we've put 200 nodes on light poles in Atlanta, and this will help us measure. It has video capabilities, but help the city measure traffic flow, help people with parking. It does gunshot detection that immediately notifies the police when the sound is made. So we're learning about all this now. We have a little bit more time in the southeast. Our rates are among the lowest in the country under our current models. So, but we want to learn, and we want to know what the future looks like, and that's what we're working on. Great.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit, because I got starting getting questions from the audience, and one of them is for Sherry. And I hesitate to ask this because it's about a flying car. And so the question is, what role do you see Uber Elevate to play in the future in the smart city? So is this for real, though? I mean, you're going to tell us, we're just between us, is it really happening, though?
I will tell you. So what Uber Elevate is a commercialization of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, more easily understood as drones for human transportation. And the answer is yes. They are coming. They are coming sooner than you think. We have a group in Dallas and a partnership with Bell Helicopter and a number of the other aviation companies to see how that can be part of the multimodal fleet.
Do you think it's going to be intercity or intra-city? How are these going to work?
To be honest with you, I don't know down to that level of detail, but here's what I do think. I think that when you start to talk about automated transportation, we need to think beyond what the near future, the autonomous vehicles, the electric vehicles, and into what the far future might be. And what I love about coming here to Carnegie Mellon is that so many of the people here are taking a look and researching and thinking about what that far future is.
Well, one of the things we have to worry about in the far future inside of a smart city is new threats and new extreme events. And maybe I want to tie in resilience to this conversation a little bit. And how does, like, maybe we start with Karina. Like, why does a city even need to be resilient? And how can some of this technology enhance the ability to cope with extreme events in a city?
So resilience means a lot of different things, and I think that is one of the things we maybe need to talk about first. It's not just about, that we can withstand record-setting rains as we have recently, or extreme temperatures or other kinds of natural events like that. There's also social resiliency that's necessary, and I think that it's something that really we do have to think about in the era of autonomous mobility, increased privatization of mobility. What happens to our social cohesion, to those ties that bind us to one another and build that sort of social relationship that keeps us as a strong community? This is something that we talk a lot about, the pressures and stressors that lie on a city, not just from the environment, but also from the social aspects of the city. And so we do think about that, and I already lost the train of thought on that.
No, that's exactly what, and I'm trying to understand how some of these technologies help us improve resilience in a future city. And maybe we would ask Joe, as a electricity provider, will the lights stay on more? Our lights are pretty reliable in Pittsburgh right now.
Yes,
Thank
they
you, Joe.
are.
I appreciate that. But as we connect more things to the internet, do you think that that will still be the case? And then how do we ensure that we protect that?
Yeah, I guess we're taking measures every day to make sure that we have a reliable, resilient grid. As you said, we do currently have one, but it's always keeping an eye on the future, right? So we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in a long-term infrastructure improvement plan to better that. And then also kind of along the lines of the theme of distributed generation, we're going to be piloting a microgrid at our Operations Center campus on the north side of the city, where our primary operations center is. So whenever there is extreme weather events, we're going to essentially harden the electrical infrastructure there. We're going to potentially pilot some generation technologies there as well, but basically hardening and improving the resiliency and the reliability of that campus, which is critical to making sure the lights stay on for all of our customers. So I'd say that who knows what the future holds, but we are at this point, we're investing significant dollars into preparing ourselves for that future.
There's a lot of questions about the connection between distributed generation and EV charging. And so do you think that new distributed generation assets would be coupled with EV charging? Have you seen examples where that works? And will it happen here in Pittsburgh or in Southern's territories?
Yeah, I think it's a conversation to have. So, like I said, the future of EV charging, if you're going to try to simulate the gas station experience, then be done in 5 minutes, is what I mentioned earlier, the 350 kilowatt hour charging. That is a lot of power. That is, when you look from a load shape, if you're thinking of in the rural setting on a corridor off the side of an interstate, one of those chargers, I mean, the spikes would be unbelievable. So I think you have to think about pairing with battery storage or microgrid, fuel cell. I think you have to have those conversations because that is what's going to move the electric transportation market, I think. Right now, fast charging, 50 kilowatt hour charging, it takes about 30 minutes. If someone's in front of you, you could be there for an hour. We've read about fights at charging stations because People are getting impatient. Please don't fight people at charging stations, by the way. But 350 kilowatt hour charging sort of solves that. And you would need banks of those chargers. So I think that is, while it's not something we've seen yet, I think that is the future, is pairing that with distributed energy.
Let me just chime in there for a second, Costa. I think this is an important point, is that we don't know what this future looks like. All that we know is that there's going to be an increased penetration in EVs, and there's going to be, or at least I believe there's going to be an increased penetration of distributed generation. So this is a critical time for us to be piloting things like Darren and Southern are doing. That Duquesne Light is, is just really getting off the ground, as I said, because we're at a relatively early stage in terms of market maturity here. But it's critical for the utility, I think, to be piloting technologies now to understand how this is going to impact our system, to impact the community that we serve. So just a plug there that we need to be piloting technologies now to better inform us for the future.
I think we might have time for one more question. Is that okay? Okay. So we're in the midst of a technological revolution in the transportation sector, but the transportation sector is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, Sarah, we can start with you, and anybody can chime in. What's it going to take to deeply decarbonize the transportation sector, and what do the timelines look like? What are the levers that need to be pulled?
I think that that deep decarbonization, it really comes with diversifying from petroleum to begin with, and that is we still have a long road to go from there, and we're also very supportive of shifting to CNG use, especially in medium and heavy duty vehicles, for the emission reduction benefits that are available there for those types of vehicles. At the Department of Energy, we fund a lot of research and development in solar, wind, geothermal, to work towards bringing down the cost of those technologies to get more renewables on the grid. So I'll just leave it at that.
Anybody else have any last-minute thoughts on either the future of a deeply decarbonized transportation sector? Karina?
I mean, I'll just say again that when we have such a huge portion of our trips that are relatively short-distance trips, that we still continue to drive and predominantly drive in single-occupant vehicles, that again, creating a walkable community, a bikeable community, really enticing these zero-emission modes of travel, and making them more viable in our urban environments and in the suburban environments as well. Creating complete streets, increasing safety, really paying attention to the human experience. This pays dividends on any number of levels.
Well, thank you. I would love for all of you to join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful conversation today.